On a night in 1910 in Venice, a woman walked through St. Mark's Square wearing nothing but a fur coat and a rope of pearls. Behind her walked a Nubian servant named Garbi, carrying a peacock-feather parasol over her head. Beside her, on diamond-studded leashes, walked two cheetahs. The people in the square stopped. They always stopped. That was the point. Her name was Luisa Casati, and she was the Marchesa of a title old enough to predate the Italian state, the heiress of a cotton fortune large enough to finance a small war, the muse of every significant artist in Europe, the patron of Futurism and the obsession of D'Annunzio, and the woman who had commissioned 200 portraits of herself because she had decided, at some point in her early 20s, that she was going to be a living work of art, and that the world was going to understand this whether it wanted to or not. By 1910, she was already in the early stages of spending every lira she had ever inherited. By 1930, she would be bankrupt, $25 million in debt. Everything she owned, and the palaces, the paintings, the jewels, the furniture, the exotic animals, would be seized and auctioned to pay the creditors. The animals would be gone. The servants would be gone. Garbi with the peacock parasol would be gone. She would flee to London with almost nothing and spend the last 27 years of her life in a one-room flat near Harrods, rummaging in theater dustbins for feathers to put in her hair, using shoe polish on her eyelids when she ran out of coal, casting spells on people she considered enemies, and drinking gin. She died in 1957 at the age of 76. She was found by a friend who had come for a séance. She was buried in her leopard-trimmed cape, with a fresh pair of false eyelashes and a taxidermied Pekingese dog placed at her feet. Her gravestone reads, "Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety." Now here's the question this video is going to answer. She was one of the richest women in Italy. She had a title, a husband, a palace, and a fortune built from 40 years of cotton manufacturing. She could have lived comfortably for the rest of her natural life without spending a thought on the future. She could have managed the fortune, maintained the position, produced the heirs, and died respected and remembered in the way that the Italian aristocracy of the early 20th century died respected and remembered. She did none of those things. Instead, she spent 30 years building herself into something that the art world had never seen and has not seen since. A woman who was simultaneously the subject and the artist, who commissioned her own mythology, who walked cheetahs through Venice and hosted balls with naked servants painted gold, and kept a wax figure of herself in the salon, complete with green glass eyes and a wig made from her own hair. The question is not whether she was mad. She may have been. The question is what she was doing, what the spending was for, what the performance was about, what a woman with everything decides to do when everything is not enough, and whether what she built with the fortune she destroyed is worth more than the fortune itself. Drop your city in the comments. And if these stories matter to you, the ones about the people who refused to be what their money told them to be, subscribe. Now let us go back to Milan in 1881, to the cotton family that produced the most extraordinary woman of the Belle Époque, and let us find out what she was trying to become. Luisa Adele Rosa Maria Aman was born on January 23, 1881, in Milan, the younger of two daughters of Alberto Aman and his wife Lucia. The Aman family was wealthy in the way that the new industrial wealth of northern Italy was wealthy in the late 19th century. Not the old wealth of the aristocracy, which was land and title and lineage, but the new wealth of the factory, which was machinery and production and an understanding of what the modern world was going to need, and how to provide it before anyone else did. Alberto Aman had built Italy's most modernized cotton mill, the Aman-Wepfer factory, in 1875, and the factory had made him very rich. King Umberto I had made him a count, which gave the wealth the social validation that industrial money required in the Italy of the 1880s, a country that was simultaneously modernizing and deeply attached to the forms of the old order. Luisa grew up in comfort. She grew up in the apartments and villas that cotton money bought, in the social world of the Milanese upper class, in the world of cotillions and theatrical productions, and the careful management of young women's social presentations that the era required of families with daughters, to marry advantageously. Her mother died when she was 13. Her father died 2 years later, when she was 15. They left behind an enormous fortune. Luisa and her older sister Francesca became, at 15 and 16 years old, the wealthiest unmarried women in Italy. This is the fact that organized everything that followed. Not the money itself, though the money was significant, but the combination of the money and the age and the orphanhood and the absence of any person with the authority and the closeness to tell Luisa Aman what she was supposed to do with her life. She had the resources to do anything. She had no guide. She had no mother to model a domestic life, no father to impose expectations, no framework within which the fortune was supposed to operate. She had the money and the freedom to decide what the money was for. 15 years old. The decision she eventually made was not made quickly or in isolation. It was made gradually over the course of the early years of her adult life in dialogue with the people she met and the art she encountered, and the dissatisfaction she developed with the role that the world had designed for a woman of her class and her fortune. That role was marriage. It was always marriage. In 1900, when Luisa was 18 years old, she married Camillo Casati Stampa di Soncino, a Marchese from an aristocratic Milanese family. He was 23. He was handsome enough, in the unremarkable way of young Italian noblemen, whose primary qualification is the title. He was interested in hunting and horses and the social calendar of the Italian upper class, and he was interested in Luisa's fortune, which was the primary motivation for the marriage from the Casati side. A title needed money to sustain it, and the Aman money was very substantial. Luisa was interested in the marriage in the way that an 18-year-old heiress with no parents and no particular alternative was interested in the only socially acceptable path available to her. She became a Marchesa. She had a daughter, Cristina, in 1901, the year after the wedding. She managed the household. She attended the parties and the hunts and the social events that the position required, by her own later account constrained. The word appears in the accounts of people who knew her in these early years. Constrained, bored, contained. The life of the demure Catholic wife of a Marquess was not a life organized around Luisa's interior landscape, which was, as would become increasingly apparent, not organized around anything that a demure Catholic wife was supposed to be organized around. She channeled the constraint initially into remodeling their homes. This is a displacement activity, the channeling of a person with aesthetic intelligence and energy and no sanctioned outlet for either. The house becomes the canvas because the house is the one thing a wife of her era and her class was permitted to direct. She remodeled. She decorated. She transformed the interiors of their residences with an attention to the theatrical and the extraordinary that went beyond what decoration was supposed to do. The houses were not enough. In 1903, at a fashionable fox hunt in the aristocratic social circuit she and Camillo moved through, Luisa encountered Gabriele D'Annunzio. Gabriele D'Annunzio was in 1903 the most famous writer in Italy and one of the most famous in Europe. He was also 40 years old, already balding, physically unimpressive, and constitutionally incapable of fidelity to any person or principle except his own aesthetic vision, which was grandiose, baroque, and organized around the premise that beauty was the only genuine value and that the pursuit of it justified everything else. He was the central figure of the Italian decadent movement. He was a poet, a playwright, a novelist, a womanizer of systematic thoroughness, and a man who had decided that his life was itself a work of art and who lived accordingly with a carelessness about consequences that was either deeply romantic or deeply irresponsible, depending on where you were standing when the consequences arrived. He saw Luisa across the field at the fox hunt and described her as a young, slender Amazon. She was 22 years old, 6 feet tall, thin to the point of translucency, with black hair that she had not yet dyed red and large dark green eyes that she had not yet begun to frame in kohl and belladonna. She was, in the conventional sense, not quite beautiful. The features were too strong, the height too imposing, the presence too aggressive for the aesthetic of the era, which preferred a softer, more yielding kind of feminine beauty. In terms of presence and intensity, unforgettable. D'Annunzio called her Core, the Queen of Hell. It was a name she clearly relished. They became lovers. They remained lovers on and off for decades. A relationship that was never quite exclusive on either side, and that was organized less around romantic attachment than around the creative and psychological nourishment that each provided the other. D'Annunzio was the person who told Luisa what she already half knew about herself, that she was not a wife and a mother and a manager of aristocratic households, but something else entirely, something that the existing categories did not have a word for, something that would have to be built from scratch. He encouraged her toward excess. This was perhaps not the most responsible thing a person could do for a young woman with unlimited money and no particular framework for its use. It was, however, the most honest assessment of what Luisa was and what she needed, and it sent her in a direction that produced something that nobody who encountered her ever forgot. He called her a living work of art. She decided to become one. The process of becoming what she intended to be was not instantaneous. It was iterative, experimental, and conducted with the specific seriousness of a person who understands that they are engaged in something important, even if the people around them cannot yet understand what it is. It began with her body. Luisa Casati was 6 feet tall in an era when the average Italian woman was several inches shorter. She was thin, eventually so thin that the accounts of people who saw her in the 1920s describe a figure of almost skeletal delicacy, a body that had been reduced to its essential structural elements. Belladonna drops had been in her eyes since at least the early years of her relationship with D'Annunzio. Drops of the toxic substance placed in her eyes to dilate the pupils to their maximum extent, creating the look of a person permanently in a state of extreme dilation. The eyes enormous and dark and slightly unfocused in the manner of someone who is always seeing more than is present. The kohl came next, applied in thick rings around the dilated eyes, creating a look that was simultaneously ancient, Egyptian, theatrical, the face of a woman in a painting rather than a living person, and aggressively modern, anticipating the aesthetic of the surrealists and the early cinema stars by 2 decades. The hair went red, not a natural red, a violent henna-infused red that popped against the dead white skin she powdered to an unnatural pallor, creating the effect of a person who has decided that their physical appearance is a costume, and who has designed that costume with the precision of a theatrical designer. The false eyelashes, the strips of black velvet glued to the lids. The strips of velvet were not merely decorative. They were structural elements in a composition that was built as carefully as a painting, each element in specific relationship to the others. She had a sculptor make a wax figure of herself, life-sized with green glass eyes and a wig made from her own actual hair, and installed it in the salon of her palazzo in Venice. Whether the figure was meant to be mistaken for her, or to be clearly a figure, was not the point. The point was the specific disturbing quality of the double. The question it raised about which one was the original and which was the copy. The question of whether a woman who had designed herself this completely was herself or was a construction. The question was intentional. The question was the work. The Palazzo Vigne dei Leoni sits on the Grand Canal in Venice in the Dorsoduro Sestiere, and it is unusual among the palaces of the canal in one specific way. It is low. It is only 1 story high at the canal level, which is why it was called the Palazzo Non Completo, the unfinished palace, because the original builders in the 18th century had run out of money and never built the upper floors. This quality of being compressed, horizontal, almost crouching at the water's edge while the other palaces rose around it, gave it its own character, less imposing than its neighbors, more intimate, more strange. Luisa took residence there in 1910. The palazzo is now the Peggy Guggenheim Collection, one of the most visited museums in Venice. In 1910, it was a somewhat derelict 18th century building on the canal, and Luisa transformed it into the stage on which the performance of her life would reach its most spectacular expression. She filled the gardens with exotic animals: 2 cheetahs on diamond-studded leashes, a boa constrictor named Anaxagoras, which she wore around her neck in place of jewelry, white peacocks trained to perch on the windowsills so that they could be admired from the canal, albino blackbirds, greyhounds whose coats she had dyed blue, parrots, monkeys. The private zoo was not a collection of pets. It was an installation, a living artwork of the kind that the surrealists would theorize about 2 decades later, and that Luisa was simply doing without the theoretical framework, because it expressed something she needed to express. She hired Nubian servants and had them painted gold. When guests arrived by gondola for her parties, they were greeted at the water entrance by these gilded figures holding lanterns illuminated against the darkness of the canal. The effect was specific, not merely decorative, but disorienting, theatrical in the sense of a theater that has no fourth wall, where the performer and the spectator are in the same space, and the distinction between the performance and the world has been deliberately collapsed. The parties themselves were designed with the same precision. She wore gowns created specifically for each event. The Queen of the Night gown by Léon Bakst, an architect of the Ballet Russe aesthetic, was one. Paul Poiret and Mariano Fortuny made others. The Futurist movement, which was in these same years developing its aesthetic of speed and energy and the demolition of the past, found in Luisa a patron and a muse. She commissioned works from Umberto Boccioni and Fortunato de Pero and wore futurist-influenced designs that expressed the same impatience with the stale conventions of the old world. She organized black masses, whether these were genuine occult ceremonies or theatrical performances, for the distinction mattered to other people more than it mattered to her. They were staged with enough technical precision to be frightening and enough artistic intelligence to be interesting. She believed in the occult. She also believed in theater. The space between those two beliefs was the space she inhabited. The canal outside the palazzo became her gallery. She would walk through Venice at night. This was her preferred mode, the nocturnal walk, the city transformed by darkness into something closer to the interior of the paintings she was trying to inhabit. Wearing her fur coat, her pearls, her kohl-ringed eyes, the animals pacing beside her on their diamond leashes, Garbi behind with the peacock parasol. She was building something. The question was, what? The artists came because the artists always come to where the money and the attention and the specific kind of excess that suggests the genuine are simultaneously available. Giovanni Boldini was the first to paint her, in Paris, where she had taken a room at the Ritz for the sittings. His portrait, a woman standing in a dark gown with the specific look of someone who is fully present in her own presence, who knows exactly what she is and is not concealing it, is one of the finest portraits of the Belle Époque and hangs now in a major collection, having appreciated in value in a way that Luisa's other expenditures did not. Kees van Dongen painted her in Venice in 1921. The painting hangs in the Milwaukee Museum of Art. The face in the painting is not beautiful in the conventional sense. It is something stronger, something that the word beautiful does not quite cover. Augustus John painted her, and the portrait is one of the most popular paintings at the Art Gallery of Ontario. Jacob Epstein sculpted her. Man Ray photographed her in 1922 in the Paris that was his studio and her playground in those years. 200 portraits in total. She commissioned them herself, paying the artists, selecting the poses, specifying the elements of the composition. This is not the behavior of a passive subject who sits still while someone else makes the decisions. This is the behavior of an artist who has decided that the medium is herself, who is directing the making of her own image with the same intentionality that a painter directs the making of a canvas. She understood something that the art world of her era was only beginning to understand. That identity is a construction, that the self is a performance, that the distance between what you are and what you present yourself as being is not a gap to be closed through authenticity, but a space to be inhabited through art. The surrealist would theorize this in the 1920s. The conceptual artist would practice it in the 1960s. Luisa Casati was doing it in Venice in 1910, with diamond-leashed cheetahs and gilded servants and a wax double of herself in the salon. She called herself a living work of art. The people who encountered her agreed, with varying degrees of enthusiasm and horror, that she had succeeded. D'Annunzio called her Corre, the Queen of Hell. Robert de Montesquieu, the aesthete who was one of the models for Proust's Baron de Charlus, was in her circle. Jean Cocteau was in her circle. Cecil Beaton was in her circle. Pablo Picasso attended her parties. The ballet russe dancers were regular guests. The specific social world she inhabited was the social world of the European avant-garde, not the aristocratic social world of her birth and her marriage, which she had effectively abandoned, but the world of the people who were making the new art, the new literature, the new aesthetic vocabulary of the 20th century. Not merely adjacent to this world, she was the patroness of it, and its most spectacular specimen. The Palais Rose was Luisa's Paris headquarters in the years of her peak magnificence, a palatial residence on the outskirts of the city that she had taken over from Robert de Montesquieu and furnished in the manner of a person for whom the merely beautiful is insufficient, and for whom the grotesque and the magnificent are the same thing. In the salon of the Palais Rose, she installed an animatronic Black Panther, a mechanical beast controlled electronically, whose tail and head moved and whose green glass eyes illuminated. The panther would growl when guests approached. It was simultaneously a joke and a threat and a statement about the nature of the boundary between the real and the artificial, between the organic and the mechanical, between the decorative and the dangerous. Cartier saw the green-eyed panther and was inspired. The Cartier Panther jewelry, one of the most iconic luxury goods of the 20th century, traces its origin to a mechanical cat in Luisa Casati's salon. She gave parties at the Palais Rose that were attended by the significant people of 3 countries, and that cost sums that would have sustained a modest family for years. The themes were elaborate. The decorations were designed with the assistance of professional theatrical designers. The clothes she wore to these parties were not purchased. They were commissioned, designed specifically for that event, each element of a performance that would never be repeated. Between Paris and Venice, she maintained other residences: a villa at Capri, a residence in Rome, a retreat in the mountains. The geography of the Belle Époque circuit, the circuit of the international wealthy and the international artistic in the years before the First World War and through the 1920s, was her circuit, and she maintained the infrastructure it required. The costs were staggering. The fortune that Alberto Aman had built from the cotton trade, the fortune that had made Luisa and her sister the richest orphans in Italy, was being consumed at a rate that no fortune, however large, could sustain indefinitely. She knew this. People told her. She did not stop. The question of why she did not stop is the question that the people who have written about Luisa Casati have answered in different ways, and the different answers reveal different understandings of what she was doing. The simplest answer is addiction, the specific combination of opium and cocaine and alcohol that sustained her energy and suppressed her appetite and maintained the state of heightened perception that her way of living required. The addiction was real. The accounts of the people who knew her in the later years of her magnificence describe a woman who required chemical assistance to maintain the pace she had set. The more interesting answer is that the spending was not spending in the ordinary sense. It was not the acquisition of things, but the production of experiences, which are by nature transient and which therefore must be continuously replaced. You cannot keep an experience the way you keep a diamond ring. The parties ended, the costumes wore out, the animals died. The wax figure deteriorated. Everything she spent money on had to be replaced, not because it was consumed in the physical sense, but because the work was a performance, and a performance must be performed again. The problem was that the work consumed the money, and the money was finite, and no one had told her clearly enough what finite meant. The First World War interrupted the circuit of the Belle Époque. The palaces were harder to maintain. The parties were harder to justify. The world that had hosted her performance, the world of the international wealthy moving between Venice and Paris and Rome with their servants and their exotic animals and their ballet russes evenings, was disrupted by the war and transformed by it in ways that could not be undone. She continued into the 1920s, years of continued performance, continued expenditure, the circuit modified, but not abandoned. Man Ray photographed her in Paris in 1922 when she was 41 and still extraordinary, the red hair and the dilated pupils all present. The presence that had frightened and fascinated people for 20 years still operational. But the accounts of the 1920s are accounts of a performance in its later stages. Still impressive, still attended, still generating the atmosphere of disturbing magnificence that was her signature, but beginning to carry the quality of something costing more than it is earning. The world was changing. The Depression was approaching. The kind of wealth that sustained the lifestyle of the pre-war European aristocracy was under pressure from taxes and inflation and the transformation of the economic order, and the fortune itself was running out. By 1930 it was gone. The debt had accumulated to $25 million, a sum that represented not just what she had spent, but what she had borrowed, against what she spent. The compounding interest on the principle of the extravagance, the way that debt functions when the person carrying it is not paying attention to what debt actually does. Her creditors moved. The possessions were seized. The palaces, Venice, Paris, Rome, Capri, were taken. The contents were auctioned. The furniture, the paintings, the sculptures, the costumes, the jewels, the taxidermied animals, the wax double with the green glass eyes, and the wig of her own hair. The artwork she had commissioned, the Boldini, the Van Dongen, the works she had paid for and owned, went to buyers whose names she may not have known. The final telegram to D'Annunzio asked for 10,000 lire. He did not reply. 49 years old, bankrupt. Everything was gone. London in the 1930s was not the Venice of the 1910s. She arrived with almost nothing and established herself in a one-room flat near Harrods in Knightsbridge. A single room in which she would live for the next 27 years. The woman who had walked cheetahs through St. Mark's Square, now walking the streets of South Kensington, in clothes that had seen better decades. The sadness of the London years is not the poverty itself. Poverty can be managed, but the specific quality of poverty, imposed on a person who has never developed the skills that ordinary life requires, because the fortune had made those skills unnecessary. Luisa had never managed money in the ordinary sense. She had never had to. The fortune had been there, and the fortune had been spent, and now the fortune was gone, and the skills for living without it had not been developed. She found ways, selling what remained of her valuables, slowly, one by one, the residue of the magnificence that had not been seized by the creditors. She accepted the help of people who remembered what she had been and wanted to preserve what she still was. She continued to dress in her way, the eyelashes, the theatrical presentation, because the presentation was not vanity, but identity, and abandoning the identity would have meant abandoning herself. She rummaged in the dustbins behind theaters for feathers. This detail, which appears in every account of her final years, is the detail that most precisely measures the distance between the nocturnal walks through Venice with the cheetahs and the peacock parasol and the life she was actually living. The feathers were for her hair. She still put feathers in her hair. The feathers now came from dustbins rather than from the plumage of exotic birds maintained at personal expense. She used shoe polish on her eyelids when she ran out of coal. This detail measures the same distance. She wrote in a journal that people who saw it described as incomprehensible. She cast spells on people she considered enemies, which was a continuation of the occult practice she had maintained throughout her life and which took on a specific character in the London years. The character of a person who has lost the material instruments of power and is attempting to maintain some form of agency through the only instruments still available. The artists and the writers still came. Not with the same frequency or the same urgency as in the years of the palaces, but they came. Luisa Casati, in a one-room flat near Harrods, was still, to the people who knew what she had been and what she represented, something worth seeing. A living connection to a world that had ended, the embodiment of an aesthetic that the fashion industry and the art world were still drawing from, the original of which dozens of imitations and homages had been made, without quite capturing the original's specific quality. Jack Kerouac wrote of her, "Marchesa Casati is a living doll, pinned on my Frisco Skid Row wall. He wrote this in the 1950s when she was in her 70s, living in the flat near Harrods. The poem is the poem of a man who understood what she was, a work of art, pinned, preserved, displayed, and also the poem of a man who had seen the difference between the living work of art and the pinned specimen. She was both. What she did not do was apologize for the spending, for the excess, for the bankruptcy, for the life she had chosen over the life that had been available to her. No apology appears in any account of the London years. She had made her choice. She had spent her fortune. She had become what she intended to become. The consequences were what the consequences were, and she was dealing with them as a person who understood that consequences are not a refutation of the choice that produced them. I could. The masquerade balls at the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni were not parties in any ordinary sense of the word. They were productions. Luisa approached each one with the thoroughness of a theatrical director who understands that the audience does not come for the performance alone, but for the experience of being inside a world that does not operate by ordinary rules. A world where the boundary between the beautiful and the frightening has been moved, where the ordinary furniture of social life has been replaced with something that requires a different set of responses. The invitations were designed by artists. Romaine Brooks designed some. Mariano Fortuny designed others. Receiving an invitation to the palazzo was itself an aesthetic event, a physical object that communicated before a single guest had arrived what kind of evening was being offered and what was expected of the people who accepted. The costumes were mandatory, not suggested. Mandatory. Guests who arrived in their ordinary clothes were not turned away, but the social pressure of the assembled company made it clear that ordinary clothes were the wrong answer to the question the evening was asking. Luisa herself appeared in costumes that had been months in the making. The Queen of the Nightgown by Léon Bakst, which was created for a specific evening and worn once and never repeated, represented an investment in a single night's appearance that would have furnished a modest household for a year. Paul Poiret made others. Fortuny made others. The guests included, over the years of the Venice parties, essentially everyone who mattered in the European avant-garde of the early 20th century. Pablo Picasso, Jean Cocteau, Robert de Montesquieu, Cecil Beaton. The dancers from the Ballet Russes, Diaghilev's company, Nerydonkina, transforming the theatrical arts of Europe with the same aggressive rejection of convention that Luisa was applying to the social arts of Venice. Isadora Duncan came. The Futurists, Marinetti, Boccioni, De Pero, came. The animals were present at the parties, which is a detail that still strikes people who read about them as improbable, but which multiple accounts confirm. The predators attended. The boa constrictor was sometimes present. The peacocks were always in the gardens. The specific experience of attending a party where you might, at any moment, encounter an exotic predator is an experience that would focus the attention in a way that no amount of elaborate decoration could achieve on its own. And Luisa understood this. The animals were not accessories. They were instruments of a particular psychological effect, the effect of a world in which the normal rules of safety and predictability have been suspended. The gilded servants at the water entrance were the first statement of the evening. Guests arrived by gondola. There was no other way to arrive at the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, and as the gondola approached the water entrance, they were greeted by these figures, illuminated by lanterns, their skin gold in the firelight against the darkness of the canal. The effect was ancient and modern simultaneously. It referenced the court entertainments of the Renaissance and anticipated the visual language of the avant-garde theater, and it accomplished something that the most expensive decorations in the world cannot accomplish, which is to tell the arriving guests that they have crossed a threshold into a different reality. She organized black masses. Whether these were genuine occult ceremonies or staged theatrical events was a distinction that Luisa herself may not have found meaningful, since the occult and the theatrical were, in her understanding, expressions of the same underlying impulse. The impulse to make the invisible visible, to give form to what exists beyond the ordinary perceptual range. He had introduced her to the occult literature of the period, and she had taken it seriously in the way that she took all serious things. Completely, without irony, with the conviction of someone for whom the extraordinary is simply the ordinary seen clearly. The evenings ended at dawn. The guests dispersed into the Venetian morning. The animals were fed. The gilded servants removed their gold. Luisa remained in whatever state the evening had left her, exhilarated or exhausted, or both, which were often the same thing, and began planning the next one. The planning never stopped. The planning was the work. The parties were the output, but the planning was the creative act, the sustained exercise of imagination and will that produced the performance. She was always several parties ahead, always working out the next costume, the next theme, the next combination of effects that would produce the experience she was trying to produce. She was working. It looked like excess. It was work. The portrait by Giovanni Boldini now hangs in a collection that values it in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly more, depending on the day and the auction. Boldini painted Luisa in Paris, where she had taken a suite at the Ritz for the duration of the sittings. This arrangement, the suite at the Ritz, the Parisian painter, the portrait that would cost what it would cost, was the arrangement of a person who understood that the portrait was not a luxury, but an investment. Though not in the financial sense, it was an investment in the construction of the myth. The myth was the work. She was 20-something when Boldini painted her. The portrait shows a woman in a dark gown, standing with the particular quality of someone who knows exactly what they look like and is not concealing it. The eyes are the center of the painting. Boldini was famous for his ability to render the eyes of his subjects in a way that made them appear to look at the viewer directly, personally, with a recognition. As if the painted figure knows you, knows something about you that you have not said aloud. In this portrait, that quality is amplified by the particular quality of Luisa's eyes, as Boldini renders them. Wide, dark, ringed in the way she was already applying in these years, with the faint quality of the belladonna dilated pupil that made her eyes appear larger than ordinary eyes. Looking at the painting is an experience different from looking at most portraits. Most portraits have subjects. This one has a presence. She commissioned 2 Boldini portraits. The second showed her with a greyhound. There are those who prefer the first. Kees van Dongen painted her in Venice in 1921 when she was 40 and at the height of her social magnificence, and his portrait is the portrait of a woman in full command of what she is. Van Dongen was a Dutch painter associated with the Fauvists, a movement organized around the priority of color and emotional directness over realistic representation, and his portrait of Luisa uses color in the Fauvist way. The face is not rendered naturalistically but expressively, the colors chosen for what they communicate rather than for their documentary accuracy. The portrait communicates that the subject is dangerous. This was accurate. Augustus John painted her, and his portrait captures something different. A quality of loneliness beneath the magnificence, the specific quality of a person whose public performance is so complete that the private person underneath is almost entirely invisible, almost entirely alone. The portrait hangs in the Art Gallery of Ontario and is one of the most popular paintings in the collection. People stand in front of it and feel something they cannot quite name, which is the experience of looking at a person who decided to become an image and succeeded. Man Ray photographed her in 1922 in a series that is among his most significant work. Man Ray was, at this moment in his early years as a photographer, still developing the techniques that would make him famous. The rayographs, the solarizations, the specific surrealist approach to photographic imagery that placed the camera's mechanical eye in the service of the irrational and the dreamlike. His photographs of Luisa are not dreamlike, they are precise. They are the photographs of a person who has designed herself with the same precision that Man Ray was bringing to his photographs, and who meets his gaze on exactly his own terms. She knew what she was doing in front of the camera. She had been in front of cameras and paintbrushes and sculptors' hands for 20 years by this point. She was the most photographed and painted woman in Europe who was not a head of state. Jacob Epstein sculpted her. Romaine Brooks painted her, a different kind of portrait, one that captures the aesthetic relationship between the two women rather than simply Luisa's appearance. 200 portraits in total. The number is extraordinary. A person who commissions 200 portraits of themselves is not a person who is passively sitting for artists because artists want to paint her. She is actively producing documentation of a self that she has constructed, building an archive of images that will persist after the self is gone. She was making permanent what was by its nature transient. The performances ended, the costumes deteriorated, the animals died. But the portraits remained, and the portraits are there now, in the collections of the world, and they will be there after everyone who is reading this is gone, and they will continue to make their argument about what she was and whether it was worth becoming. She thought it was. The portraits make the case for her. D'Annunzio called her Core, the queen of hell. He also called her the divine. He called her Felina, the feline one, the cat. He wrote her into his novels under a pseudonym. He dedicated works to her. He gave her the validation she needed from the person who had the cultural authority to give it. The most famous writer in Italy, the avatar of the Italian decadent movement. The man whose idea of what a human life could be was large enough to accommodate what Luisa was trying to do. The relationship lasted decades. It was not a love affair in the conventional sense. There were other lovers on both sides, other entanglements, other people who occupied Luisa's attention, and D'Annunzio's at various points during the years they were connected. It was a creative and psychological partnership, the partnership of two people who had each decided that their life was going to be organized around aesthetic excess rather than social convention, and who recognized in each other the quality of that decision. He was not a stable person. He was a genius of a specifically destructive kind, brilliant, charismatic, constitutionally reckless, always in debt, always in flight from consequences, always seeking the next patroness, the next experience, the next intensity. He spent his entire life running from what he owed and toward what he desired, and the two lists were always longer than anyone could fully track. He was also, in the years of his involvement with Luisa, the person who told her most clearly what she was. 22 when they met, already constrained in the marriage to Camillo, already sensing that the role of the demure Catholic wife was the wrong shape for her life. D'Annunzio did not create the Marchesa Casati. Luisa created the Marchesa Casati, but he provided the aesthetic framework in which what she was doing could be understood as serious, as art, as the kind of thing that the people who mattered in the world of ideas took seriously. He encouraged her toward excess. This is both his most significant gift to her and the most significant damage he did. The excess was genuine. It was not a pose or an affectation, but the authentic expression of what she was. And it needed encouragement to reach its full expression. But the encouragement was given by a man who had no regard for consequences and no financial stake in the outcomes, and Luisa was the one who paid the bills. He never answered the telegram asking for 10,000 lire. This detail is in every account of Luisa's bankruptcy, and every account places it in the same position. At the end of the section on the bankruptcy, as the final statement, the punctuation mark that closes the story of the relationship. She had given him decades of patronage, presence, inspiration. She had funded parties at which his presence was the centerpiece. She had been his muse, his core, his divine Marchesa. When she needed 10,000 lire, he did not reply. This is not quite a betrayal. D'Annunzio was incapable of the sustained attention to another person's needs that betrayal requires. To betray someone, you have to have understood what you owe them, and D'Annunzio had never understood what he owed anyone. The unanswered telegram is less a betrayal than a revelation, the revelation that the creative partnership, for all its intensity and all its mutual productivity, had been organized entirely around his needs and his vision and his aesthetic, and that Luisa's needs, when they arrived in the form of a request for money rather than inspiration, were invisible to him. She had been Core, the queen of hell, the divine, the feline, the living work of art. When she needed 10,000 lire, she was just a woman in debt. He did not answer. The flat at 32 Beaufort Gardens in Knightsbridge is still there. It is in a Victorian terrace building of the kind that lines the streets of that part of London, undistinguished from the outside, a building that does not announce itself as the final residence of anyone remarkable. The Marchesa's name is not on it. There is no blue plaque. There's nothing to indicate that the woman who walked cheetahs through St. Mark's Square and threw balls for Picasso and organized black masses on the Grand Canal ended her life in this building, on this street, in one room. She arrived in London in 1932, 2 years after the bankruptcy. She was 49 years old when she arrived. She was 76 when she died. 27 years in the flat near Harrods, 27 years after the decades of Venice and Paris and Rome and Capri. The people who visited her in those years left accounts that are the most honest testimony to what she was in her essence rather than in her expression. Stripped of the palaces and the animals and the servants and the costumes, what remained was a woman of extraordinary presence, of undiminished intelligence, of fierce aesthetic conviction, and of genuine if unconventional warmth for the people she admitted to her company. She was funny. This detail does not appear in every account, but it appears in enough of them to be worth noting. The accounts of people who spent time with her in the London flat describe a woman with a gift for the precise, slightly savage observation, the comment that identifies exactly what is wrong with a person or a situation, and names it in the terms most calculated to be both accurate and amusing. Curiosity persisted too. The journals she was keeping may have been incomprehensible to people who tried to read them, but they were evidence of a mind that was still working, still processing, still trying to make meaning from what she was experiencing. She was reading, she was thinking. In the one-room flat in Knightsbridge, she was still engaged with the ideas that had organized her life, the occult, the aesthetic philosophy, the question of what art was and what a person could make of themselves. She received visitors, not the celebrities and the artists of the Belle Epoque circuit. Those connections had mostly not survived the distance and the years. But she received people who were interested in what she represented, who understood that they were in the presence of someone who had been at the center of something significant. The fashion industry's debt to Luisa Casati is larger than the fashion industry has always acknowledged. John Galliano said it plainly in 1998. The Dior couture collection that season was Casati. The rich velvets, the feathered headpieces, the dramatic eyes, the specific combination of opulence and danger. These were translations of an aesthetic that Luisa had developed and executed across 3 decades of the early 20th century, and Galliano was honest enough to name the source. Karl Lagerfeld brought the Chanel Cruise collection to the Lido in Venice in 2010 with Casati as the explicit inspiration. The Lido was the beach resort of the Belle Epoque social circuit, the place where the international wealthy gathered in the summers before the First World War, the place that Luisa had moved through with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to every space she occupied. Lagerfeld understood that bringing the collection to the Lido was not simply a location choice, but a statement about lineage. This is where this aesthetic comes from. This is the woman it comes from. This is what we are inheriting when we inherit it. Tom Ford cited her. Alexander McQueen cited her. The Marchesa Fashion House, a fine wörter by Cotton Kisos, founded by Georgina Chapman and Karen Craig, producing the gowns that the red carpet world has associated with the specific kind of dramatic feminine beauty that blends the theatrical with the dangerous, is named for her directly. The name is not a metaphor. It is an acknowledgement. Cartier's Panther. The green-eyed mechanical panther in the salon of the Palais Rose, the animatronic beast that growled at guests and whose green glass eyes illuminated in the darkness of the salon, was the inspiration for the Cartier Panther jewelry that became one of the most iconic luxury goods of the 20th century. The Duchess of Windsor wore it. Elizabeth Taylor wore it. Countless women who never heard of Luisa Casati wore the specific aesthetic she had created without knowing they were wearing it. This is what legacy looks like when it passes through fashion. It loses the name, but keeps the form. The panther eyes are everywhere. The woman who kept the panther has been mostly forgotten by everyone, except the people who make the things that reference her. The Italian publisher Rizzoli published a biographical graphic novel, La Casati, La Musa Egoista, The Selfish Muse, in 2013, by artist Vanna Vinci. An English translation appeared in 2015. An opera premiered with the Dutch National Opera in 2020, Willem Yeats's Ritratto, which means portrait, which is the right title for an opera about a woman who commissioned 200 portraits of herself. In 2020, Italian rapper Achille Lauro dressed as Casati for his performance at the Sanremo Music Festival, the most important musical competition in Italy. And millions of viewers saw the look without knowing the reference. The Palazzo Venice dei Leoni is now the Peggy Guggenheim collection. Hundreds of thousands of visitors a year walk through the rooms where the parties happened, past the artworks that Peggy Guggenheim assembled and donated to the world. The garden where the cheetahs lived is a sculpture garden. The canal entrance where the gilded servants waited with lanterns is now the museum entrance, where visitors line up and buy tickets. Peggy Guggenheim arrived in Venice in 1948 and bought the palazzo from the heirs of Doris Castle-Rose, who had owned it after Luisa's bankruptcy. Guggenheim opened her collection to the public in 1951. The palazzo became the museum in 1980, when Guggenheim died and bequeathed it to the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation. The two women who most thoroughly inhabited the Palazzo Venice dei Leoni are connected by more than the building. Both were heiresses. Both chose Venice as the stage for a life organized around art and excess. Both left the palazzo under financial pressure. Both were commemorated in the museum that the palazzo became. But Luisa came first, and the parties she threw in those rooms, the animals in those gardens, the gilded servants at that water entrance, are part of what made the palazzo the specific building that it is. Charged with something, resonant with the memory of an excess that the current institution preserves by very different means. Visitors walk through the rooms. They look at the Picassos and the Brocks and the Duchamps and the Ernsts that Guggenheim collected. They look at the Grand Canal through the palazzo's windows. They probably do not think about the cheetahs, but the cheetahs were there. The belladonna poisoned her. The drugs she maintained across the decades damaged her health in ways that are documented by the people who knew her in later life. The loneliness of the London years was real. The accounts of friends who visited describe a woman who was isolated, who had outlived or outrun most of the people who had known her in the years of the magnificence, who was maintaining herself in conditions of genuine deprivation. She was also, by those same accounts, still herself. The kohl, the eyelashes, the journal, the spells, the visitors who came for seances, the feathers in the hair. It continued in reduced circumstances because the performance was not separate from her life, but was her life, and a life that is a performance does not pause for poverty. She said at some point in her life, the quote is preserved in the biographical literature, that she did not want to be a woman. She wanted to be a living work of art. The distinction between woman and work of art is the distinction that organized her life. A woman, in the world she had been born into, was a wife and a mother and a manager of aristocratic households, and she had been all of those things briefly and had found them insufficient. A work of art was something else, something that transcended the ordinary categories, that was simultaneously more and less than a person, that would persist after the person who made it was gone. She chose the work of art. She spent everything she had on the choice. She died in a one-room flat near Harrods. She is buried in Brompton Cemetery with Shakespeare's line on the stone. The Cartier Panther is in the catalogue. The Boldini is in the collection. The Palazzo is the museum. The fashion houses keep citing her. She is gone. She is everywhere. That is the story of the woman who spent $1 billion on being alive. The billion is gone. She is not entirely. The gravestone says so. Age cannot wither her. It cannot. Not this one. Not yet. The question this video opened with was what the spending was for, what a woman with everything decides to do when everything is not enough, and whether what she built with the fortune she destroyed is worth more than the fortune itself. The fortune in 1881, when Luisa's father died and left it to her, was one of the largest private fortunes in Italy. It is gone. Every lira of it is gone, consumed in the becoming. The palaces, the parties, the costumes, the animals, the portraits, the performances, the opium and the cocaine, and the champagne and the crystal balls, and the Egyptian statuary, and the ballet russe evenings, and the mechanical panther, and the gilded servants, and the diamond leashes. What remains is the portraits, the fashion collections that cite her, the jewelry house whose panther traces to her salon, the palazzo on the Grand Canal that is now a major museum, the gravestone in Brompton Cemetery. The 200 likenesses distributed across the collections of the world, accumulating value as the art market accumulates value, appreciated by people who look at them and understand that they are looking at something that had not existed before and has not quite existed since. She said she wanted to be a living work of art. She spent everything she had on the attempt. Whether she succeeded depends on what you think art is for. If art is for the creation of beautiful objects that persist through time, then she failed. The objects she created were her parties and her costumes and her performances and her walks through Venice, and these are gone as completely as the fortune that funded them. If art is for the disruption of the ordinary categories of the possible, for the demonstration that the human person can become something that the existing vocabulary cannot adequately describe, then she succeeded as completely as any artist of her era. She was a woman who was born rich and died poor, and in between was something that the world had not seen before. The woman who spent $1 billion on being alive. She spent it all. She was worth it. That is not a financial statement. It is an aesthetic judgment. And the aesthetic judgment is the only one that in the end she would have accepted. Age cannot wither her. The gravestone says so. And the gravestone is in Brompton Cemetery, in London, and the palazzo is in Venice, and the panther is in the Cartier catalogue, and the portraits are in the museums, and the fashion collections keep citing her, and the feathers she pulled from theater dustbins in the last years of her life are gone, as she is gone, as the fortune is gone. But she is not gone the way ordinary people are gone. She is gone the way she intended. As art.